Raymond couldn't believe that he was finally where he had always dreamed of being. He saw the bustling port city called 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡. His friends shared his joy, because this is where their big adventure will begin. They live in an era when adventurers embark on their own journeys and, overcoming difficulties, become heroes. Behind the gates, mysterious portals that at one point started appearing all over the world, lurked terrifying monsters that could not be found in the world of 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒𝑟 before. Countless adventurers have died in the gates, but powerful objects of unimaginable might continue to call to the hearts of those who dared to dream. 𝑑𝑣𝑒𝑟 stated that their team would definitely need a decoy, for it was impossible to plan an operation while it was unknown what awaited them beyond the gate. He was sure that many adventurers had died because of such surprises. The young man stated that they needed a slave to attract the attention of the monsters so that the others could escape. In order to find suitable bait, they traveled to the marketplace of the 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒𝑟 trade union. The representative of the union proudly explained that all the slaves in the cages were designed to be bait, and therefore allowed them to choose anyone, but still advised them to take 2 guys who had recently arrived, as they had excellent physical shape, and 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 did not think long. Soon the whole group was standing in front of the portal, and when 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 left a marker to notify the other adventurers that the area was being explored, they jumped in. It was a very mysterious world. Raymond admitted that it was the first time he had seen something like this, but he was told not to worry, because usually the gates were located far away from the monsters' habitats. Suddenly, behind Charlotte's back, a creature that looked like a huge toothy stump appeared and chewed the girl in one go, which made the rest of the forest inhabitants also come out into the light. 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 prepared for battle by activating his fire arrows, but after realizing they were surrounded, he ordered them to tie the slaves to a tree and get the hell out of here. Though reluctant, Raymond obeyed the order, ignoring the pleas of the unfortunates, who the next second began to be torn alive by the monsters. Carrying his wounded partner on his back, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 concluded that this was a failure, and therefore mopping up was not important now. The first thing to do was to find a way out, since it was impossible to get out the same way they had come. Noticing his younger comrade's confusion, the fat man named Taryn shook him by his clothes, ordering him to gather his thoughts and listen to the orders of the group captain. He explained that despite today's failure, there was always the possibility of mopping up the gate again, but suddenly he himself found himself torn apart. In order to avenge his slain comrade, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 drew his bow again and was about to fire, when suddenly the monster seized the adventurer with its huge tongue and drew it into its mouth and chewed it. Raymond rushed forward, but tripped and fell down, and the next second he felt how the monster clung with its sharp teeth to his legs and began to gradually pull him into its mouth. Suddenly the boy noticed one of the slaves on a tree branch, who seemed to have managed to free himself and not become the next bait of the overconfident adventurers. Raymond begged for help, justifying that he did not want to do that, and when he noticed that the slave was not in a hurry, he threatened that he would never get out of here alone. But soon he was eaten by the forest creature, just like his friends. The next target of the monster was the saved bait, and it rushed forward, but one swing of its spear was enough to make the monster's head roll on the ground separately from its body. The young man was determined that if he was ever going to die, it would certainly not be here. Watching the blazing world and the Dragon King Horntail flying towards them right now, the warrior assumed that the Kentori nest had already fallen, and therefore there was nothing more to count on. From the Swan Knights and the Resistance to the Silent Crusade and the Adventurers, not to mention the 6 heroes who were the hope of humanity, they had all fallen. Now it was all in the hands of the last adventurer, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡. He then offered to go on their final journey, but soon the bodies of their breathless comrades lay around the young man, who knelt powerlessly, unable to believe that now truly was the end of all things. They had taken a huge blow, but in the end they had only managed to chop off one Horntail's head, and that was now growing back. It had all been in vain, and so now it was the end of not only 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡's journey, but the whole world. However, he just couldn't let it end so easily. Philip, Jaden, and 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 were all his closest friends dead, and the adventurer refused to accept that. He rose to his feet and gathered his last bit of strength, determined to finish this damn dragon off, even if it was the last thing he would ever get to do in this life. 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 threw a spell at the monster, but it only absorbed him. The young man didn't understand why he looked so pathetic right now. If only he had the strength right now, he would definitely change everything. Finally, the adventurer's eyes closed, but even after death, he dreamed of a new beginning. Suddenly he was awakened by the shouts of the warden, who threw water on 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 so that he would finally wake up. The man ordered the wretched bait to know his place and not to cheat by pretending to be sick. He didn't know where Horntail was, or if he had managed to survive. As 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 looked around, he realized that this place seemed familiar to him, and as he listened to the people who were offering the best price and taking the shackled prisoners, he realized with horror that he was in a slave market. He didn't understand what was going on, for human trafficking had been abolished long ago, but if memory served, it had been this boor who had sold him 6 years ago, when 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 had been such common bait. He was surprised to conclude that he seemed to have traveled back in time, but his musings were interrupted by the fist of the traitor, who didn't like the slave staring at him. 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 traveled back to the very beginning of the story that day, though he still couldn't tell if it was all happening for real or if he was just dreaming. It didn't make any sense, but there was simply no other explanation. However, when he saw the very group of adventurers who had bought him at the very beginning, there was no doubt left, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 had gotten a second chance. Having familiarized himself with the staff of fire arrows left over from the death of its previous owner, the young man concluded that it was the perfect weapon for him at this point, but it wasn't enough. He was sure that these adventurers must have brought something else with them since they were going to farm here. He knew that some had valuables in their boots, and the guess proved correct, considering that soon a ring of telekinesis shone on 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡's finger. Suddenly, another pack of monsters emerged from the forest, and the adventurer saw this as the perfect opportunity to put the staff of fire arrows to the test. Having created a real flame vortex, he decided to also use the ring and lifted the monsters above the ground, but after a few seconds he realized that while using telekinesis will not work for a long time. But the difficulties didn't end there. At one point the staff also stopped firing arrows, but given the lack of visible damage, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 assumed that the weapon was simply reloading. In this case, there were no other options but to go into hand-to-hand combat, and after a couple of blows, the staff and the ring became active again, so the young man decided to repeat the combination, and soon all the opponents were defeated. Suddenly he was called out by the squeezed girl, noticing that 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 was clearly no ordinary bait slave. Given his skills in fighting and using magic, she asked who he was, and after looking at the torn bodies of his comrades, she assumed with horror that he had done it too. The boy argued that she was wrong, though it didn't matter, for even if they had survived, he would have killed each one with his own hands, for he hated those who used others as bait to survive. Walking down the street to the amazed looks of people wondering how the bait had managed to get out alive, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 pondered the need to act quickly, lest he find himself in the same position as last time again. First, however, the slave status had to be removed. Lord 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒𝑠 didn't understand what was so special about a slave coming back alive, as it happened quite often, but when he heard that all the others, including the adventurers, were dead, he decided to find out more about it. By the way, the reporter said that instead of just running away, this slave showed up at the guild himself. It seems that he knows very well that it is useless to try to hide from them, because only death will grant them freedom. There was something else extraordinary. According to the statements of others, this slave also awakened the first circle, which confused the Lord. This young man also wants to change his contract and become an adventurer, which made 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒𝑠 furious, but when he heard that Lord Larkin himself had ordered to pay attention to this case, the man calmed down, although he did not understand why the guild director was suddenly interested in some stinking slave. Despite the official abolition of slavery, this was only the tip of the iceberg, for people had always been slaves to money. Those who couldn't pay their debts on time paid by labor. 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡's father was his only kin, and so when he died, the young man also joined the ranks of the caste slaves. He took black moss from the guild to cure his parents' illness, promising that he would definitely pay, but they demanded an amount that was 3 times the average market value of the herb. Thus those scumbags had exploited him for 6 whole years, but now it was time for revenge. Soon 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 was sipping tea in the company of Mr. 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒𝑠, who decided to get right down to business, admitting that he already knew enough about his guest. The man agreed to give him the status of F-rank hunter, but he was not going to play by someone else's rules, so he demanded E rank. 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒𝑠 reminded him that he wasn't even recognized by the Adventurers Association yet, and even though he'd been to the gate several hundred times in the last 3 years, he was still new to killing monsters. 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 remarked that adventurers were never judged by their ability to fight, for the first adventurer had gained fame through wit and the ability to survive, for the information that survivors brought was far more valuable than any skill, and the man did not dispute this statement. 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒𝑠 noticed that the slave had reached great heights, returning from the portal alive time after time, but reminded him that people like him were only taken on operations to clear the gates of lower ranks. The Lord asked him not to think that the guild members were foolish enough to sign a contract with an overconfident young man, but still decided to give him a chance to prove his skills by telling him about a dungeon with a limited group size for entry of 5 people and with 20 marks on the pillar. This meant that at least 24 adventurer squads of 5 or more members each did not return, but 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 agreed to take the contract, and was soon getting acquainted with his future comrades. A team tank named Shiv said he had heard about the status the newcomer had previously held, but immediately warned that neither he nor his partners cared. In any case, he explained that the purpose of the sweep was not to hunt monsters at all. It was to recover the items of those groups that had been in the dungeon and did not return. They are paid 3,000 in local currency for each item, which, however, seemed to one of the adventurers a real robbery, because the clothes of those guys would have remained there, and, given that some members of those groups had one circle, their equipment is worth at least 7,000. Once inside, Shiv warned that due to the nature of the area, the cleanup might take a while, so he suggested they set up camp. A tree was chosen as a vantage point from which to get a good look around, and soon it was set up for habitation. When everything was ready, Shiv suggested to split into 2 groups and scout the situation. Tom, Max, and Roa should go to the east, and he and the newcomer to the west. In case of danger, they should make a sign and return to the base immediately. Wandering around, the pair surprisingly found no monsters or objects, so Shiv assumed that their base was simply too close to the entrance. Tank inquired about the newcomer's first mission, and 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 admitted to being a little nervous. Shiv explained that it wasn't surprising. For example, he himself worries every time he enters a portal. By the way, as is already known, he had heard about his partner's past. A bait slave, he can't even imagine how hard it is to carry such a burden. Shiv was about to suggest 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 to join their squad, but when he turned around he realized that he remained standing aside, so he asked him not to take what he had heard into his head. Late at night, the tank asked the newcomer if he was asleep, but Thomas was sure he was, reminding his comrades of the dose they'd put in their dinner. 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 was lucky if he didn't die from it at all. The bandit was already anticipating how much money he could get for the staff of fire arrows alone, so he decided to get down to business and swung his knife over his unfortunate partner's sleeping bag. Piercing the blanket, Tom found only a log tied with pillows, and so Shiv shouted that it was imperative to find the freak, as he couldn't have gotten far. Suddenly, their tree house blew apart and the remaining structure was engulfed in flames, and with it the equipment of the failed assassins. The team's problems didn't end there, however. Max turned his attention to a huge shapeless monster, and Shiv finally realized that the person they were trying to trick was using them as bait for the monster himself. The acting of these rogues didn't impress 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 much. They clearly shouldn't have shown their goodness if they wanted to deceive. Besides, this gate had already taken the lives of 24 groups, but instead of looking for an experienced hunter, these idiots welcomed a newcomer into their ranks. It seems that this monster that is currently chasing the rogues is the boss of the dungeon. Of course, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 assumed that it would be a difficult opponent, but he didn't even think that it would be so huge. Scurrying away, Shiv warned his companions that this kind of monster, and if he was not mistaken, it was a golden slug, was the worst enemy for them. It's almost impossible to encounter such a creature, as it only inhabits dungeons with red gates, and its body is made up of acid, so it's the worst situation for melee warriors. Suddenly the tank ordered to dodge, and in the next second a blob of the very same acid flew over the heads of the adventurers, which literally melted the rock where it hit. The group continued to run away, and Shiv stated that they had to get out of here first, as the monster had to wait for a recharge for the next long-range attack. The only way to defeat this slug was to wait for the right moment to attack and destroy the core in the monster's head. However, Max decided not to wait, but to attack right now while it was recharging. Ignoring the captain's shouts, he rushed forward, preparing his knife, but was suddenly split in 2 by a new acid arrow, although, according to his calculations, there should have been another 10 seconds left. Watching all that was happening, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 assumed that these guys were finished. Just as he had suspected, the slug was getting stronger by eating objects, and with that, the time to recharge the acid arrow was shortening. Now he understands why no squad has ever managed to get out of here alive. Not only is the boss here already very strong, but with its size it could match even the inhabitants of the yellow gate, whose level is twice as high as the red one. Considering that a one-round adventurer would definitely not be able to handle such a creature, and the items could be forgotten about, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 concluded that the sweep was a failure, but suddenly the slug's gaze fell on him. He fired his staff, but the slug was almost unharmed, though he aimed directly at the core. At this rate, at least 5 more shots would be needed, but it didn't matter, because 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 was going to prove to the Lord that he could fight monsters himself. Armed with a cable, he rushed forward and maneuvered in the air, avoiding the attacks and acid arrows of the enemy. This way he managed to hit the monster 3 more times, but from the penultimate attack slug still managed to dodge. Despite its size, he was quite fast. It was of little use, however, as 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 managed to hit it once more. Finally, the monster's defenses were down, and there was only one last blow to the exposed core. Before blowing the monster apart, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 used telekinesis to rip the sword to which the rope was attached out of the ground, and then just before it landed on the ground, he finally released one last fire arrow, splitting the slug's core. At the last moment, he used telekinesis to stick the sword into the tree opposite and jumped onto the branch before the monster splattered the area around it with its acidic innards. After waiting for the toxic liquid to settle and partially soak into the ground, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 jumped down and took the core of the stricken slug with him before heading for the exit. Soon he was already seated across from Lord 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒, who, by the way, had become convinced that the former slave could do more than just scratch his tongue. Nevertheless, he noticed that his companions, as well as the necessary items, were left outside the gate, but the young man explained that he had fallen in with rogues who wanted to take away his belongings. Upon hearing that the boss of the dungeon turned out to be a golden slug, the man realized that all the items borrowed had simply melted away. The guild simply can't ignore such financial losses, but the problem is that 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 came back alive. There are a few general rules at the gate. First, the number of people who can enter is limited, and until all of them are out or killed, the gate doesn't work. Second, the limit on entry depends on the difficulty and level of the circle. By the color of the circle, you can tell how dangerous the dungeon is, and if the adventurer's level exceeds the difficulty of the gate, he simply won't be able to enter it. Third, you can only raid once. This is a big problem, because if someone inside the gate survives and goes out, the portal will simply break and no one else will be able to enter. That's why unless all the adventurers inside die, there won't be another chance. Although the boss of that dungeon was indeed a very difficult opponent, and all the objects were melted, 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒 noticed that the task was still failed, but the young man asked to listen and, explaining that he had eaten a slug, showed his wrist, on which there were already 2 circles, which shocked his interlocutor. Now, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 asked for any rank, as promised, but the man shouted that he would give him AD or even AC if only the boy agreed to cooperate with him, and soon the latter was signing the contract. Usually, if someone gives a rank of C if the adventurer has not yet reached 3 circles, it is considered prejudice. Generally speaking, circles are an indication of an adventurer's strength, and there's quite a big difference between them. However, the Lord didn't understand how this psycho had gotten another circle just by eating the golden slug's mana core. Now 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒 realized that he wasn't lying when he talked about his survival skills, because he had recently received the first one, and he had already returned from the dungeon with the second circle. He had never seen such a rapid increase in his life, so he decided to get 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 for himself. The young man himself noticed that he started to be treated well even faster than he thought. In any case, there was not much time left, for the moment when the red gate would open, where only 100 people could enter, would come very soon. Many trade unions and guilds were watching this event, so it's not surprising that 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒 was interested in it as well. In any case, this assignment would not hurt his plans in any way, and, rather, even on the contrary, it would help. But before he left, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 asked his new employer to lend him some money. Rumor has it that the gateway began an era of adventure, but few know that, in fact, it was a black mage's trap. Many adventurers died in the dungeons, and with them the future potential of the maple, and soon the final day came. All the monsters that were buying themselves time had crawled out, and humanity had lost this war. All of this was to happen in just 3 years. The world of 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 would once again repeat the unfortunate fate. The money 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒 gave wasn't much, but it was still enough to start. Only adventurers with a limit of 100 participants can enter the red gate with no more than 2 circles. Normally, 𝐴𝑑𝑣𝑒 would only choose high-level adventurers, but this time they decided to invest in a newcomer since they need this gate. Although 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 had gotten the money, it would be foolish to waste it on trinkets, and items that matched his level would probably be too expensive. If he wanted to buy something decent with that money, he would only go to one place. The merchant inquired as to whether the young adventurer wanted to buy a decoy or a slave to fight alongside, but 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 asked to be taken to one man. The two soon descended to a prison for the punishment of particularly naughty goods, and as they approached a cage with a slave whose legs and arms were chained by powerful chains to the very wall, the man warned that the man was very dangerous, but 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 already knew that. Before his return in time, there was an incident that resulted in the death of one person, bringing the end of the world closer. The hero with the axe, Aaron, is the first and last apprentice of the girl Debo, better known as the Killer of Heroes, and started the beginning of the end. He behaved differently last time, but now the situation is somewhat different. Still, treating an adventurer like this, even if it was an ex-adventurer, was crossing all boundaries. The merchant repeated that the guy was a real psycho, but 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 knew that Debo's skills matched his character. In fact, they were often compared. They were from the same region, had awakened almost simultaneously, and were generally similar in style. But what united these adventurers the most was that they were both in dire need of money. He was left with a sister suffering from a terrible disease called black blood, so Debo advised the young master to get out if he didn't have money, but the latter showed 1 million MES, which made the raging slave settle down and the merchant fall into a stupor. However, the surprises didn't end there, as 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 wasn't going to use Debo as a slave, but wanted a full-fledged contract that left him free to choose which items he would take with him from the dungeon. When he was sure that his new employer would not change his mind, Debo did not hesitate for a moment to bite his finger and sign the document in blood. 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 then offered to go to the gate at once, and the slave promised that he would work harder than anyone the young master had ever worked with before. Of course, Debo expressed his gratitude for the gift of the axe, but he remarked that he was more accustomed to using a sword, but 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 was adamant. Soon they reached a gate with 1 marker and a limit of 8 men. His partner asked where the others were, but 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 told him not to worry about it, and then literally shoved his overly talkative companion inside. Debo was clearly unhappy with this decision. Not only would they be clearing out a dungeon designed for 8 men alone, but he would have to fight with weapons to which he was not accustomed. Suddenly a whole pack of ravenous stumps appeared in front of the adventurers, and Debo recognized his mistake, as the monsters most likely ran to the shout. He knew that these creatures were renowned for their incredibly tough bark and had already prepared to correct the mistake, but 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 ordered them to step back, using his fire arrows. After the ravenous stumps had turned into an ordinary pile of roasted wood, he admitted that he had not expected his comrade to do such a thing in the beginning, and asked him to be more careful from now on. Showing the boss the full pouch, Debo reported that he had collected all the mana stones, which turned out to be 27 of them. Now he obeyed all orders without question, as the man he thought was a crazy bastard turned out to be a serious guy. He was trying to figure out if he was using telekinesis, because he had never seen anyone else use fire arrows so skillfully. In any case, being around a talented man, Debo realized that he could make a lot of money. Even with the 8-3 split, he was sure that he would not only be able to pay for his sister's treatment, but also for his own living. Soon 𝐿𝑎𝑚 found another group of stumps ahead, consisting of 8 or 9 individuals, which was a perfect find, though his partner could not understand why. However, he quickly realized what was going on, as soon as he chopped the first monster in half. The new boss ordered his mentee to personally break the stumps, which really pissed off the latter, as he holds an axe for the first time in his life. By the way, watching his partner's movements, 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 himself realized that he was not lying when he said that he had always fought with a sword before. Still, he was sure that Debo would soon realize that no weapon would reveal his potential better than the axe. There was no reason to doubt it, because this guy was the only one the heroine Aaron had chosen as an apprentice. As he chopped the stumps one by one, Debo saw for himself how comfortable he was with the axe. He was quickly learning how to wield it, and although his circle had not yet awakened, he was already doing quite well. Finally, the stumps were finished, but the next moment the ground itself began to shake and the boss of the area, a giant stump, emerged from a nearby rock. 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 managed at the last moment to push his partner away before the monster brought its giant foot down on him. The young man warned that size was not an issue, on the contrary, it would even be easier to hit that way, but surprisingly, the stump was able to block the fire arrow. In such a case 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 decided to use telekinesis as well, but the second failed shot made it clear that magic was useless against this opponent. Debo shouted for his comrade to run away if he wanted to live, and 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 decided to take the valuable advice, though something was not right here. After a bit of thought, he realized he was wrong. The stump wouldn't have defended itself if it had been immune to magic, so it was all about the branches. 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 ran away to a safe distance and asked his comrade to take care of the little thing that had decided to support its wooden leader, while he decided to fight the boss himself. The first fiery arrow hit the branches again, and so Debo prepared to run, sure that it would not be possible to break through the defense of the stump, but then the second projectile flew, which had already hit the target. As expected, the monster's branches move with incredible speed. That's why it was impossible to hit between them even with telekinesis, but since 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 had already reached the second circle, he could use magic repeatedly without recharging. Watching one arrow fly after another, Debo couldn't believe his eyes. The stump certainly couldn't defend itself against 2 attacks in a row. He was so engrossed in admiring his boss that he missed a couple of smaller stumps, which immediately went after the second adventurer. Elpum wondered if his partner couldn't handle the little ones, but he couldn't be distracted, so he darted forward again, jumping between the branches of the huge monster. Suddenly one of them almost hit him, but at the last moment 𝐿𝑎𝑠𝑡 came to his aid and took him out of the path of the blow, which saved his life. Elpum was glad to see that his partner was of some use, and so he suggested that the stump should be finished at last.